Hello and welcome back, this is ProTaleDev back with another Dungeon Farm Tycoon game. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the specific navigation, the pathfinding, and also the stats of the game. So the player stats, the world stats, and kind of how the gold ties in with all of that. I have already recorded this video before, but there was an issue with it and it ended up being too long, so I'm just re-recording this. And so you're not going to see the other video, but hopefully I'll be able to cut this down into a much more specific video that's much shorter. So first thing I'm going to show you is exactly what it looks like now that it's been a little bit. It's been about a week and a half to 2 weeks since I've been developing this. Immediately you're going to see that I'm using the A-star pathfinding. If you want to look at the A-star pathfinding, then it's online. Basically, it'll look for a specific layer of objects that have a collision, and if there's a collision in the way, it'll just find a path to a specific object based on what target I'm giving it with a seer script. So look that up. It'll basically tell you how this works. As you can see, the first target that an adventurer will go to is our dungeon. This is already all coded in, so I've already finished the adventurer code, so another one will spawn now and it'll head to the nearest dungeon or potentially a different dungeon. It's really randomized. I'll show the script in a minute, but basically once it gets to a dungeon, it then runs a dungeon quest which has a pretty high chance of death and low chance of success. At the moment, you'll have to upgrade a dungeon in order for it to have a higher success chance, and you'll need equipment and lots of really different stats that we'll cover in a second. As you can see though, we've got, at the moment, we've got 2 adventurers. You can see this on here. Right now I don't have the icon set up, but this is our population, which is 2, and so far 3 adventurers have actually spawned. So the fact that we've got 2, or now 3, means that we have lost 1. So what we can do now is, while we're in the actual game, and at the moment I've got Gizmo set on. This is what it actually looks like for most players, but I've got this on just so I can see the grids and the pathfinding, just to show it off. But at the moment there's no way to get to these stores. This means that they won't be able to make any money, so we're just going to lose money. But what I can do is open this up, and you'll see immediately pathfinding is now open. Now they'll automatically be set into the store. If they can't find a store, they will go back to a dungeon, which could increase their rate, but they'll head to a store, they'll buy something that's completely random. I believe there's 3 items, and they'll just choose whatever. Our adventurers have a specific amount of gold in their inventory, in their overall stats, which they can spend, and that means that if they have multiple journeys, they may end up losing or gaining gold. They get gold from these dungeons, and if they increase in gold, obviously they'll have more to spend at shops. Otherwise, they'll just have less and they'll move on. Depending on their happiness, they'll either choose to leave, or they'll stay and go to another dungeon. It looks like our adventurers currently are going to leave. This is because their happiness, there's nothing really in this on this island that will increase or decrease their happiness too much yet. But that's basically the basics of this. They'll go to a shop when they want to buy something, and they'll go to dungeons to do quests. Whether they win or fail, it increases their experience and things like that. So this is basically all we have at the moment. We do have our miners here, which I'm going to go over now. And the best way to do that will be to show you in the script. So I'll let this run for a little bit while I'm showing this off, and we'll come back to it and we'll see if we have less gold or more gold. So I've done some playing around with the collisions of how these islands work, and so the collisions are actually quite different for these areas now. I've also sorted them out a little bit better in their own sections. This is necessary for the obstacle layer, which determines what objects have actual collision, and this makes it so that the adventurers can't go off into the ocean. So it's very basic collision stuff, and I've played around with this, but ultimately I think I'm fine with this script staying as it is. But the destruction script is now giving us money. So our current gold, this is the overall player stats, which is our current gold overall. So this is in our game at the moment. If I were to just turn this off and then go to buy flowers and trees, you'll see that our money is going up. Oops, didn't mean to do that. At the moment, you can't destroy these shops because I've made them so that, because these aren't meant to be here, they're meant to be connected to the path like these. But you can, at the moment, just destroy stuff, destroy trees and plants and things, and you can get money. Not as much though as if you were to buy them. So if I were to get some trees and just try and place some, so if I just place them, you'll notice that our money is significantly going down, and this is because it's not worth as much. So let's make sure that's open so that we can just leave this on. Now the next thing I'm going to quickly show you, because that's how we're making some money. That's the only thing I've added to this script. Now we've got placement. Placement hasn't changed too much. Really, I wanted to move away from placement for these what I've been working on. But overall, so everything's kind of similar, apart from the fact that when you place an object down, it'll spend this gold, so you'll lose a little bit of gold depending on what objects you spawn in. At the moment, it's just depends on the category of the item, but soon I'll have individual items have their own amount of gold that they'll lose. The other thing to mention is that the icon here, here we have our default icon, and the color will change transparency whenever we click on it. So if I've got this tree here, you'll see that it's slightly grayed out compared to an actual object. The easiest way for me to show this probably is the in. So you'll see it's very hard to see, so I'm probably going to make it a little bit more faded out, but it's slightly faded out at the moment. And then when you click, it goes back to full color, so the alpha goes back to full. So that's just a little bit of extra to help players know what they're doing, what they can see. And obviously you do have this this box for selection. I've added that in so that player knows exactly where they're adding, so you can do that as well. The deselection works as well. This is now working completely. It didn't work last time, but now it is. Again, I'm going to let this run. I'm going to create a quick path to these shops. In fact, I'm actually going to make it really easier for them so that it's a little bit quicker. I didn't mention last time, I think, but these these green, like the saturation of these green trees, means that they are protected and cannot be destroyed. This will add a bit of diversity to the level building, because there'll be certain things you'll have to work around. So while that's running, we're going to talk about the next thing. So before I move on to the adventurer and the time manager, I want to talk a little bit about the navigation. It's just a simple waypoints that I'm maneuvering around the map. And these waypoints are just dotted around based on the seeker scripts, their start path, and they're just updated using these A star. So if you want to look it up, there's loads of videos on this how this navigation works. So I really highly suggest going and check that out. Before we move on to the adventurer and time manager, I want to go into the player stats. So player stats is specifically all of the overarching stats of the game. So this is kind of what the player you should be managing and looking at and checking out. The adventurer has their own individual stats, as I've mentioned. However, this is what really matters for progressing. So your current gold is the overarching gold, the over amount of gold that the overall gold that you'll be earning and you'll be losing. So you need to keep this up, and this will allow you to build more things, expand, build more dungeons and things like that. Your current water is going to be very important because this is provided by buildings such as wells, reservoirs, and other things like that. And this will be very important because if you don't have it, the adventurer's happiness will drop. You should have a maximum amount of water should be increased overall, and you need to make sure that you have more water than citizens, essentially. It's the same thing for food. I'm not sure if these will cause different effects yet, but they probably will. Our current rating is our overall rating of the island that we have based on the happiness and fear that we have. So our adventurers will have a happiness and fear, which is coded in already. And when they finish their adventure, so if they leave the island or if they die, depending on how their experience went will determine their happiness and fear, which will in turn determine the actual rating. The rating will also be affected by the buildings and the scenery and lots of other different things. Then we have, obviously, as I mentioned before, current food, very similar to water, and it's but may have different effects later. We have our population, so maximum population, so how many people we can actually have inside on our island, and the current population, which you could see on there. It's already here, which is currently 2. Then we have our housing, and housing is a little bit different. So housing will determine how many people stay on the island longer. So when they've had an adventure and they've gone to a shop, if their happiness is high enough, they'll actually choose to stay at a house or an inn or a hotel or something like that. And they'll stay for more and more days, which means they'll have more and more experience, they'll get stronger, the chance of them dying will be less and less. So those are the overarching, the overall stats that the player will have to manage. I don't want to go into it too much detail in the code, but it's very, very simple. At the moment, we just have here a couple of codes, some statements, if statements that determine what finds the dungeons, the shops, and houses, and calculates how many we actually have overall on the map. And that'll determine the maximum housing that we can have, because each building will have its own housing times by its length, how many that are actually available. So we've got that. Now what we're going to look at is the adventurer. The adventurer is probably the most important script because it handles individual adventurers. May not be the most optimized code, but it's the best I've got. I've separated all the floats so that it's easier to see, and I've added some comments just to make it easier to see as well, to read. So what we're going to do is, of course, we've got some script that's going to find the dungeons, shops, and houses, because this is going to be necessary. We also need a reference to the navigation controller and the player stats. Now, the stats that we're going to be working with is the death chance. This is very, very important. So this is the chance of death within the dungeon. It starts off pretty high, so it's actually more of a living chance. So imagine this is actually chance of survival 20%. I call it death chance just as a reference to what its overall meaning is behind it, but it's actually more of a living chance or chance of survival. So at the moment it starts at 20%, but you'll start off with some basic random values. I'll go in that in a second, but first of all, so that's just a chance of dying. So then we have the current fear, which it starts at 50, the same as the happiness, but the fear will drop as you, the fear will generally drop, which will decrease the rating later on. So if before they die, if they're in a dungeon and they're unsuccessful and they're about to die, the fear will drop, which will result in the overall island's rating dropping when they die. So when they finally die in the dungeon, their rating will drop and their happiness will, their fear will go up, their happiness will drop. This will affect the rating big. However, you'll also have the same thing for a successful dungeon quest. So the fear will drop and the happiness will go up. This balance that you'll have to manage individually will really depend on their experience and their overall equipment rating, which is determined by your stores. You'll have to really change, improve your island in order to increase the chance and the fear dropping and the happiness rising. So the next thing is the wanting to stay. So as I mentioned previously with the housing, if an adventurer has had a good experience with the dungeon, has managed to increase their rating high enough, and overall the scenery and things have added to their happiness, and their fear is low enough, then they will actually choose to stay. This will actually turn to true, which will trigger their ability to go to a house, and that will reset their overall timer staying on the island. So this is really good because the longer they stay, the more shops they visit, the more dungeons they do, which increases the overall experience, which brings us into our next thing, so experience. So little experience will mean increased chance of death and fear, but more visits to the dungeon will increase the experience. Experience is also determined by the equipment rating, as I just mentioned, and of course the dungeon visits is added to that. So the more times they do it, basically, and the more times they stay, the better it will be, and the more chance they will survive. So next is the dungeon timer. So this is how long they stay in the dungeon, And high fear will mean less time in the dungeon, so they'll be at the very base, which I think is 30 float, so it's very, very short. But the more time they spend in the dungeon, the more gold they'll earn, so they'll have more gold on themselves, and they'll be able to survive more, because overall they'll be able to buy higher level equipment. Again, just mentioned there, gold is very, very important, especially when they'll start off with a certain amount of gold. And then that's randomized, and they will spend that on the stores. They'll also get a bit from dungeons, which will help them to continue if they decide to stay. You have the shop visits, dungeon visits, and house visits. This is going to be important later, but this is just general stats. The dungeon visits is very important at the moment, but the others aren't too important yet. But the dungeon visits add to the experience. Equipment rating is based on the shops visited, as I mentioned, also the level of the shop, so the upgrades and lots of other different aspects. Then you have the pre-experience. So if an adventure, as you would expect, an adventurer would come in all different variations of level. So the very basic would be something like a rookie, and the most advanced would be something like a veteran adventurer. So this pre-experience kind of adds to the chance, the little bit of a random aspect to their survival chance at the very beginning, and they'll start off with between 10 and 25%. That's not too bad. Then they'll add on to that and do and lots of other different things will add on. Their overall time on the island, so this online time, once that's up, they will automatically leave and finish their adventure on the island. This is important because you don't want to stay on the island forever. This can reset, like I said, if they go to a house, but they can only visit a house 5 times, so they can only do 5 days essentially, 5 missions before they have to leave no matter what. This is so that you do get new people in, new adventurers in, and it's not just crazy easy, like all your adventurers are just high level and not going to die. So the next is your move to dungeon, move to shop, and adventure complete. Adventure complete is just like this online time. It'll trigger this adventure complete and they'll leave. This is important because we want everything that is to do with our adventure to be separate. This is like a last minute turn off option, so that it'll automatically, the adventure will no doubt leave after a certain amount. So the next thing I want to talk about is, obviously there's a lot to this, but the most important thing that I have to stress is that there's a lot of randomized elements to this. So there's a lot of randomized floats and integers to really give a random experience and a random values to our adventurers. This will give a different experience in general. The player's probably not going to notice this too much, but the important thing is that their experiences will vary. Obviously, if their chance of death is lower than, say, 40% or halfway, and this will determine the time they spend in a dungeon. Where they go will be determined based on where they've been. And without getting into this code too much, basically these if statements that we're looking at now basically control where they go and what adds to what. Right here we have our happiness and fear, and depending on what those values are will determine if they want to stay, if they don't want to stay and they want to leave, or what kind of rating they have. So if happiness is greater than or equal to fear, then they'll increase in rating, while if it's the opposite, they'll decrease, and that's when they leave. Again, I've already shown these random values. Obviously this is just a just sort of something to add on to it. I could have automatically made this at the start, but this is much more simpler and easier, and it's a little bit more flexible later if you want to change how the random value stats work. Then we have our at dungeon. So this will actually happen when you get in range of a dungeon and you've been to a previous one. It'll add the dungeon visit and it'll start the quest. Let's go down to our quest. So when the quest actually starts, and this is after a certain amount of time, what will happen is it will run this code, determine our random death, which if it's greater than our death chance, then what will happen is we'll actually go and find a store. It'll go to the store, and we'll lose fear and increase in happiness because we successfully completed the quest. We have a debug.log here just telling me what's happening. Then we have a random death. If it's less than or equal to the death chance, then we'll add fear and less happiness. So this means that they actually are still quite fearful, that they're still going to die, and this will overall still determine the rating, because what they've done is they've actually died here. Yeah, so what's happened is that in the end they have actually died. We're still lowering the happiness, increasing the fear, because ultimately they've died and we lose rating. We can still increase rating even if they die as well, but only if the stats before it were high enough. So the next thing I want to talk about is the shop. So after they've been to a dungeon and they successfully completed that, they'll actually head to a store. Automatically, they will always head to a store after a dungeon unless they can't get to one. Then they just won't go anywhere. So when they actually move to the store, so it's right here I believe, or is it here? It's one of these. Once they've actually made it to a store, then what they'll do is they'll trigger a visit, they'll start this timer, this function, and it'll be down here after a certain amount of time. So then they'll have the same thing as before, a random buy, so they'll choose between 1 and 3. Let's say they choose 2, and they'll end up spending some gold that's on their current character, their adventurer, and they'll also add equipment rating to their overall equipment rating, which will increase the experience. So I believe I showed that, but I'll show it again. I'm not 100% sure I showed it. Oh, it's right here. Don't know why I couldn't see it. So we have our pre-experience, our equipment rating, and that adds onto our dungeon visits, and that creates the experience. And the experience is equal to the death chance. I should have explained that before, but basically it's all intertwined and connected. So increasing the overall equipment rating will result in a higher chance of survival. This is really important because you want them to stay longer in general. What they buy is really important as well. So if we go to 1, you'll see that they'll increase in 5 rating, which is a whole 5% onto their death rate, their death chance. So increasing that survivability by 5% is huge. And if they did that a second time, that would obviously be 10%. So it's huge, that. Next we have our wanting to stay. So after they've been to a shop, if they want to stay, which is false, so if their happiness isn't high enough and their fear is too high and they haven't actually decided to want to stay, then they'll actually just leave. They'll actually head to a dungeon because if their happiness is actually high enough, it's greater than or equal to 50. If their happiness wasn't, the fear was higher, so their happiness was lower, and they didn't want to stay, they would actually leave. So their online time would hit 0 and they would just leave. While if their wanting to stay is true and there's enough space for them, so if the maximum housing is greater than the current population, or equal to the current population, then they will be able to stay. So current housing will increase to 1 and they will head to the house. Obviously once they get to the house, once they're actually at the house, it will trigger this, which will ultimately start a very similar process, a timer, and they'll stay there until, which will reset, and then they'll head to a dungeon and start the whole process again, resetting their online timer. So that was the really heavy code, which was very, very important to discuss. It's also why it took so long the last video to explain. Hopefully it's a little bit shorter this time. Obviously we won't know. It should be shorter. So now we're on to the very last script, which is Time Manager, and this manages the spawning rate of our adventurers as well as a few other extra things such as the timing and also when you get your gold based on how many, the maintenance, I think. So let me quickly check, because this was one of the first scripts I actually wrote on the break, so it's been a while. So what we got here is our gold increased based on how many adventurers numbers that we have on our island. So we'll get that every I think it's every day we'll get that, and this time is just a simple timer that tells us the time, so we can keep track of what day it is on the left. And we also have here is our overall adventurer spawning and our current rating. So our current rating determines how often our adventurers spawn. This is really important because we want the highest rating so that we have loads and loads of people spawning. This last bit here, which is spawning the adventurer, was actually really added later, but I worked on this script earlier for the timing. So what you're going to see here is me actually probably delete this for now because it's not necessary right now. This one. And what we're going to do is basically, we don't need these comments either. If it's less than or equal to 50, then it'll do this. If it's less than or equal to 50 and the current rating is greater than or equal to a certain amount or less than, then it'll do a certain rating. And this will ultimately determine when the spawning is. So the spawning time is invoked when if this is true, and it'll only do it once. It'll then set to false, and then once it's finally spawned our object, it'll set back to true, but based on the time of the spawning. So that is everything. Let's go back to our spawn right now, and as you can see, we are still in our adventure. However, we have we actually have 3 adventurers at the moment, which is nice. They're heading to shops. We've actually made quite a lot of money, which is nice. I started off with 500 just for testing, and what I'm going to do is going to click on this adventurer and kind of show this off. So at the moment we have our land, these timers. When they set, they change. He's had to set to 0 automatically, so he's heading home because his happiness isn't high enough. You can see all the different stats that we got. So the equipment rating is 10. They had some happiness, ended up being 61, but they've just left, so it wasn't good enough. Because their fear wasn't low enough. Ultimately, it's very simple code, and there's actually a lot to it. Hopefully, I've covered this as best as I can. There was a lot to cover, and I've just had to kind of go into it straight up. But hopefully, I've explained it enough, and you can always pause the video to look at the script in your own time. But basically, these are all the stats that we can work with now, and I'm going to be moving on to something else. Before I do that though, after the previous video I worked on didn't work out, I did start creating my own sprites based on the same art style as this. This didn't take too long, but it was just something fun for me to do to break up the development, and these are all the different items that are going to be in the game next video. So, this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.